Economic and political moments in recent years as tensions with the United States escalate once again, this time driven by President Donald Trump's renewed threats of tariffs and an unprecedented demand tied to Greenland. European diplomats, trade officials, and political leaders are now weighing how far they are willing to go to protect the bloc's economic sovereignty while avoiding a full-scale trade war with their most powerful ally. At the center of this debate is a rarely used but highly controversial tool often referred to as the European Union's trade bazooka, officially known as the anti-coercion instrument. On January 18, European Union ambassadors reached a broad consensus that their current approach toward Washington needed to shift. For months, the EU had attempted to manage tensions with restraint, hoping that dialogue and compromise would prevent another wave of tariffs similar to those imposed during earlier phases of the Trump presidency. However, Trump's latest announcement pushed the situation into new territory. The U.S. president declared that 8 NATO member countries would face a 10% tariff on all goods exported to the United States beginning February 1. According to Trump, these tariffs would remain in place until the United States was permitted to purchase Greenland, a territory that remains under the sovereignty of Denmark. This linkage between trade penalties and territorial acquisition stunned European capitals. While Trump has previously expressed interest in Greenland, framing the issue as a strategic and economic opportunity for the United States, European leaders viewed the tariff threat as economic blackmail. The idea that trade barriers could be imposed to force the sale of territory raised alarms not only within the European Union but also among NATO allies who feared long-term damage to transatlantic relations. Trump further escalated the threat by stating that the tariffs would rise to 25% on June 1 if no agreement were reached. Such a move would represent a dramatic increase in economic pressure and would likely disrupt supply chains across multiple industries, including manufacturing, agriculture, aviation, and consumer goods. European policymakers immediately began calculating the potential cost, not only in terms of exports but also in political credibility. French President Emmanuel Macron emerged as one of the most vocal advocates for a strong and unified European response. In private exchanges with other European leaders, Macron suggested that the EU should seriously consider activating its anti-coercion instrument against the United States. According to diplomatic sources, Macron emphasized that Europe could not afford to appear weak or divided when confronted with what he described as coercive tactics. He argued that failing to respond firmly would set a dangerous precedent, inviting further economic pressure in the future. At the same time, not all European leaders shared Macron's sense of urgency. Irish Prime Minister Michael Martin acknowledged that the European Union would retaliate if necessary but cautioned that activating the anti-coercion instrument might be premature. His remarks reflected a broader concern among some EU members that an aggressive response could spiral into a full trade war, harming European consumers and businesses at a time when the global economy remains fragile. The European Union's debate over retaliation is informed by recent history. In May 2025, following an earlier wave of sweeping tariff announcements by the Trump administration, the EU prepared a retaliatory package worth approximately $107 billion targeting U.S. imports. These measures were designed to hit politically sensitive industries concentrated in Republican-leaning states, including bourbon whiskey, airplane components, soybeans, and poultry. The logic was clear. Economic pressure could translate into domestic political pressure within the United States. However, that package was ultimately suspended for 6 months after negotiations between European ambassadors and the U.S. administration produced a temporary agreement. While the suspension eased tensions, the deal was never fully ratified by the European Union. According to reports from Brussels, lawmakers signaled that Trump's renewed threats tied to Greenland could effectively kill any chance of final approval. This left the EU in a familiar but uncomfortable position, having already demonstrated restraint, yet facing renewed pressure that called into question the effectiveness of diplomacy alone. As discussions continued in Brussels, sources indicated that the tariff-based response enjoyed broader support among member states than more extreme anti-coercion measures. Reuters reported that while opinions on invoking the anti-coercion instrument were mixed, there was growing agreement that some form of response was unavoidable if the U.S. followed through on its threats. The challenge lay in choosing a response that was strong enough to deter further escalation but measured enough to preserve the long-term partnership between Europe and America. The 8 NATO countries targeted by Trump's tariff announcement issued a joint statement warning of the risks involved. They described the tariffs as dangerous to transatlantic relations and cautioned that such threats could trigger a downward spiral of retaliation and mistrust. The statement underscored a shared concern that economic disputes could spill over into security cooperation, weakening NATO at a time of heightened global uncertainty. To understand why the anti-coercion instrument has become central to this debate, it is important to examine what the tool actually is and why it was created. Adopted in 2023, the instrument was designed to prevent and address situations in which a foreign country uses economic pressure to force political concessions from the European Union or one of its member states. The regulation explicitly aims to deter economic coercion and, if necessary, enable the EU to respond with countermeasures as a last resort. Although the instrument was initially conceived with China in mind, European officials acknowledged from the beginning that it could also apply to other major powers, including the United States. In recent years, both Washington and Beijing have increasingly used tariffs, export controls, and access to natural resources as tools of foreign policy. European policymakers feared that without a credible deterrent, the EU would remain vulnerable to pressure from larger economies. The anti-coercion instrument grants the European Union a wide range of options. These include restricting or halting imports of goods and services, limiting foreign investment, and imposing measures related to intellectual property rights. The European Commission has emphasized that any response must be proportionate to the harm caused, carefully calibrated to minimize unintended damage to the EU's own economy. According to the Commission's guidelines, the process begins with an investigation. Once a country is accused of economic coercion, the Commission has up to 4 months to assess the situation. If a majority of EU member states agree that coercion has occurred, the instrument can be activated. Even then, the EU's first step is negotiation. Retaliatory measures are only implemented if talks fail to produce a resolution. Despite its sweeping powers, the anti-coercion instrument has never been used since its adoption. Many European officials view it as a deterrent rather than a tool meant for frequent deployment. Invoking it against the United States would mark a historic shift in transatlantic relations and could have far-reaching consequences. Trade between the European Union and the United States remains one of the largest and most integrated economic relationships in the world. In 2024 alone, bilateral trade approached $2 trillion, accounting for nearly 30% of global trade and 43% of global GDP. Millions of jobs on both sides of the Atlantic depend on the smooth functioning of this relationship, making any disruption potentially costly. The European Union itself is a bloc of 27 countries with a combined population of approximately 450 million people. Its economic strength lies not only in its size but also in its ability to act collectively. However, achieving unity among such a diverse group of nations is often challenging, particularly when national interests and economic exposures vary. From an analytical perspective, Trump's Greenland-linked tariff threats represent more than a trade dispute. They reflect a broader shift toward transactional diplomacy, in which economic leverage is used openly to pursue strategic objectives. For European leaders, the concern is not just the immediate impact of tariffs but the long-term erosion of norms governing international trade and diplomacy. Critics of Trump's approach argue that tying tariffs to territorial demands undermines the principles of sovereignty and mutual respect that underpin the international system. Supporters, on the other hand, contend that economic pressure is a legitimate tool for advancing national interests, especially in a competitive global environment. Within Europe, the debate continues. Some leaders believe that standing firm now is essential to prevent future coercion, even if it means risking short-term economic pain. Others warn that escalation could damage the EU's own industries and weaken cooperation with the United States on critical issues ranging from security to climate change. As February 1 approaches, European officials face a narrowing window for decision-making. Whether the EU ultimately activates its trade bazooka or opts for a more limited response will signal how far it is willing to go to defend its economic autonomy. The outcome will not only shape the future of EU-US trade relations but also influence how other global powers perceive Europe's willingness to stand up to pressure. For now, diplomacy continues behind closed doors, with both sides weighing their options. What is clear is that the dispute has already exposed deep fault lines in the transatlantic relationship. Whether those lines harden into lasting divisions or are smoothed over through negotiation remains to be seen, but the choices made in the coming weeks will likely echo for years to come.